Hey there, I want to welcome you to Wednesday's edition of Journey Through the Gospels. And today we find ourselves in Luke chapter 13. And we see another encounter that Jesus has with church leaders when he does something on the Sabbath. Let's take a look at it in verse 16. It says, "On a Sabbath, Jesus was teaching in one of the synagogues, and a woman was there who had been crippled by a spirit for 18 years. She was bent over and could not straighten up at all. When Jesus saw her, he called her forward and said to her, 'Woman, you are set free from your infirmity.' Then he put his hands on her, and immediately she straightened up and praised God. Indignant because Jesus had healed on the Sabbath, the synagogue ruler said to the people, 'There are 6 days for work, so come and be healed on those days, not on the Sabbath.' And the Lord answered him, 'You hypocrites! Doesn't each of you on the Sabbath untie his ox or donkey from the stall and lead it out to give it water? Then should not this woman, a daughter of Abraham, whom Satan has kept bound for 18 long years, be set free on the Sabbath day from what bound her?' When he had said this, all his opponents were humiliated, but the people were delighted with all the wonderful things he was doing." Now here again we see Jesus doing something. In this case, he's healing on the Sabbath. And the church leaders, in their defense, one of the 10 Commandments says to keep the Sabbath day holy. But their problem was that they had forgotten the original purpose and intent that God created the Sabbath day. They had taken the Sabbath day, something that God had created, and simply was this, that God built in a day off from work each week. And that's really the bottom line, the basic intent that God had, was that we would get a day off each week, because he knew that the human body and mind couldn't survive working 7 days a week, 365 days a year. He knew that we couldn't survive that, and so he put it in there and said, you need to take a day off each week. That was the intent. But the church leaders, the Pharisees, the Sadducees, and here the synagogue ruler, they had taken the Sabbath and they had sat down and would argue, okay, what constitutes work? We want to make sure that we obey the Sabbath, so what constitutes work? And so they sat down and they wrote out, how many steps that you could take on the Sabbath before it was considered work. They would decide, how heavy is something that you could pick up. If it's too heavy, it's considered work, and you can't work on the Sabbath. And so, they came up with all of these extra biblical things that totally missed what God's intent was, and that was simply to give a day off. Now, I think it's in some ways, it's kind of funny in this, that the synagogue ruler says to the woman, she's healed, and he says, "Indignant because Jesus had healed on the Sabbath, the synagogue ruler said to the people, 'There are 6 days for work, so come and be healed on those days, not on the Sabbath.'" He can't even see that a miracle has just occurred, and he basically says, "Hey, you know what? If you people want to be healed, you should come back. You shouldn't get healed today. You should have come back on one of the other days, because this is the Sabbath." He's so wrapped up in that it happened on the Sabbath that he can't even see that a miracle has just happened. And then Jesus turns the table on him and says, "Now look, you hypocrite." And remember, hypocrite, he's basically saying, you say one thing, you practice another. He says, "You hypocrites, don't you take your ox or your donkey out on the Sabbath to get them water? And then here you are saying that she shouldn't be healed on the Sabbath. You're saying one thing, but you do another." The bottom line is this on the Sabbath, is that God created a day for us to have off. And that was really the point of it. And so I hope that if you don't do it regularly, that every week that you take at least one day off. God created it for us for that purpose. And I heard one person say it like this. They said that God says that someone who won't work, he calls lazy. But someone who refuses to take a day off, he calls disobedient. So we don't want to be disobedient. And it's not law, but the Sabbath is something that God created, a wonderful thing for us, to give us that day off so that we can be refreshed and rejuvenated for the coming week. And I hope that you do that each week, and because God put it there. That's going to do it for today. Hope you have a great rest of your Wednesday, and I'll see you tomorrow. We're going to be in Luke chapter 14 tomorrow. I will see you then.